Thanks a lot. Thank you. Okay, so as Sharina already announced, the talk today will be about the UX of AI products. Let me first tell you how I got from Chinese studies to a PhD in AI. So that was around 2010. I was studying Chinese, basically, it was in Berlin. And somehow I got interested in this topic of künstliche Intelligenz or artificial intelligence. So I went to the Technical University of Berlin and started taking just some basic coding courses because obviously if you want to do AI, you need to study coding. That was the general wisdom at the time. Obviously now it's a bit different. And then I remember that I talked to several graduate students at the university, so like PhD candidates and so on. And for them, artificial intelligence, it was something that was like very, let's say, marginal, right? So they told me, okay, there is this one professor in a specific building sitting high up there, and maybe you need to talk and to go and talk to him, right? So it was a professor in machine learning, like really doing PCA, logistic regression, and all these basic things, right? So that's just, to illustrate that at that time, that was 2010, 2011, right? AI was really not the hot and not the cool stuff. Today, of course, the situation has changed very much, so especially since end of 2022 with ChatGPT, AI has come to the masses, right? It seems like everybody is using it, although when you try to actually ask people, what do you use in production? What really makes your life more productive? There is not so much for many of them, right? Most of them do use ChatGPT, right? But for the other applications, I can tell you I code a lot. I have played around with Copilot a lot, but it's not exactly what makes the coding much more productive, right? So that's why today, this talk, I would like to keep it in the spirit of an AI reality check. We will go into a case study in B2B AI development. So that's a project that I did at my company. Basically, it's, let's say, AI consulting and custom development for bigger companies. And then we will dive into this topic of UX design and especially of shaping the human AI partnership or a relationship. And we will see why for us, it was a very important component in the project beyond the technology, right? Beyond the data, beyond the whole backend story, just to make this project succeed. So that's the agenda, right? First, I will describe the case study. I have to say that it is big parts of it are confidential, so I will not be able to tell you too many details about it. But then we will dive into the second topic, so basically shaping the human AI partnership. We will look at some important components of this partnership, and then I will be describing our specific learnings from this case study, so more on a conceptual level. Cool. So first part, the B2B reality check for AI. So as said, the project that we did, it was custom development in a typical B2B setting for a large corporate, right? So at the beginning, you have a very long setup phase. For us, it was 9 months, right? So it's not really this super agile product development as we normally know it from digital companies. During that time, of course, we need to do strong customization of the AI models, right? So both to the industry specifics, it was a company in the travel service industry, and then also to the company specifics. Then very important point, the product needs to work after it is launched. Makes sense. If you spend 9 months of time and of money on building something, then it needs to work. Whatever works means in terms of AI, right? Because of course, evaluation and saying what is basically evaluating the quality and the productivity gain of a new AI product is a non-trivial topic. And then, of course, big company, a lot of hierarchy, a lot of decision-making paths going on. So basically, there are high requirements also on transparency and accuracy, because of course, whenever the AI gives some output, people also want to be able to trace it back, to support it with data and so on, which totally makes sense. So that's the setup. Now a bit more about the project. Basically, the customer, as said, a global premium travel company, and their main need was, as it often happens to big companies, right? They're often very much focused on themselves, so their own history, their past. I think that that's what we often see with big companies, right? They kind of rest on their past and on the achievements of the past, and also, of course, internal politics, so the strategy that they have set for the next years and so on. And this company was wise enough to realize it and to say, okay, we really want to build up this kind of situation awareness for the market in which we are in. There is a lot changing. There is AI coming. There is a lot of sustainability issues coming. Consumers are getting more and more demanding and so on. So we want to see what are the relevant trends in our market. Right? And that was basically the first part of the solution, which was mainly analytical, that we build a component that allows them to monitor their market and to extract relevant trends in very different categories, so technologies, products, consumers, and so on. And then I assume that many of you have worked with analytics, right? So often the problem that we get there is that we can get super good insights and so on, but as long as we don't know how to act on them, how to follow up on them, the best data is not really worth so much, right? So that's why we added the second component, which is basically recommendations of specific actions and the use cases that the company can implement to address the trends that we identified in the first part, right? And this basically makes the whole system much more valuable and much more actionable for them. So just a quick wrap up on the UX that we built for them to give you this rough idea, right? So as I said, the first part is mainly about predictive AI, about analytics. So here the main UX concept is basically a data visualization, and we made it as interactive as we could for them. So in the limits of the complexity that they also admitted. Focus on transparency, right? So basically always giving them the possibility to trace back the data to the original sources. And then also something that we call progressive disclosure that I will talk more about is that basically we start with very simple data analysis, and then we go into the depths and we basically allow them to build more flexible and more fine-grained analysis. Then the second component, action recommendations. So here, of course, we started with all these fancy concepts. Well, not fancy, but like conversational UX. Okay, they want to ask questions. They want to get recommendations for their specific and unique situation and so on. That was a bit of an overkill, right? So what we learned is that, okay, it makes sense to start with something that's simple and familiar. Right? So in that case, because the AI is already novel, right? There are already a lot of components that are novel to it, where they need to adjust their user behavior. So basically here we just started with something like a search engine for these recommendations, right? So inspired by these familiar websites like booking.com, Airbnb, and so on. So that's the UX summary. And now let's dive into the second part, so shaping the human AI partnership. First, why is it important? Let's look at some data and try to read them. So here, basically, you can see results of a recent survey. It was among US citizens, but I would say that they're probably not less conservative than we Europeans are. So here you can see the emotions and the feelings that people have when they face AI, right? And you can see that most people, when they think about advances in artificial intelligence, they feel cautious, they feel concerned, skeptical. Then comes a part of the curious crowd, right? And then come those that are scared. I'm actually surprised that the scared ones are so low down in the chart. So basically the set of emotions, right, that we see, and that's outside the technical cloud, right? Of course, we as product managers, many of you work at digital companies and so on. Of course, we live in this bubble where we play around with the models all the time. We read the news and so on, right? But that's just, the general, basically, statistics of the population, and you see that it's quite, let's say, it seems like people are very conservatively minded when it comes to really using AI, right? So that's why we really believe that, as companies and as product builders, we really have this responsibility of changing that landscape, of educating users, and of building up their trust into artificial intelligence. So here are some of the core components that we identified and that we also use as a working model in our work on UX design for AI, right? So we started with the mental models, which are changing with AI. Then the mental models can be shaped by explaining AI and educating people about AI. Based on correct mental models, we can then build trust, right? And once users have trust, we can also ensure that there is a co-creation going on, right? So co-creation both between us as product builders and the users, but then also between the users and the products themselves, right? So that the products are actually augmenting the users. Let's look into these components. So first, starting with the mental models. AI is changing our mental models of digital products, right? So here you can see a progression from Jira. Is it? Oh, yes, it is Jira. I wanted to put, initially I wanted to have SAP there, but I think that many of you wouldn't recognize the interface. So basically Jira, right, where the interface is very well defined, is graphical, we know all the components that are there, right, all the links are highlighted in a specific color, and all of that is very familiar, and that's really like the interface completely limits and defines the interactions that are possible with the interface. Versus here, right? So that would be a typical AI interface. It's not our interface. As said, we switched away from the purely conversational interface. And here what you can see is that the interaction is basically very freestyle, right? So users can just use natural language. Even if you try to somehow explain that the system or the bot can only answer specific types of questions, you can be sure that new users will come and will ask questions that are completely outside of its spectrum, right? And then on the other end, on the back end, you have a model, right? So ChatGPT, Llama 3, Anthropic, whatever. And the problem is that this model, basically, it contains all these capabilities of the system in it, right? So it's not the interface which defines these capabilities in an explicit way, but instead they're hidden in the model, right? Then you go, you fine tune the model to a new industry. How do you make sure that your users know that this model now actually works for this new industry, and so on? So that's why at the beginning, when you start building, it's can be useful to assume incorrect mental models, right? So either assume that your customers don't have a mental model of AI at all, and then they will build it. And if you don't educate them, then most probably it will be not correct, right? Or that they have an incorrect mental model from the beginning. So just to give you some examples, we have here a couple of potential dialogues, again, in this B2B context between customers and engineers, right? So you have a customer, a person that's very business oriented, they have a problem, they look for a solution. They're not necessarily very interested in AI, and they're busy, right? So they don't have time for all this AI knowledge, understanding, and so on. And then on the other hand, you have the engineer, the prototypical engineer, right? So someone who is fascinated by AI, they have time and maybe not the time, but probably the passion to read all the stuff, right, to get into it. And probably it's the person, if it's a machine learning engineer, then it's the person on the team who understands AI the best, which is not always good in this kind of conversations with customer. So first misconception that we frequently see is, of course, wrong causal relations that can happen with many different models, use cases, and so on, right? So for example, the AI does X because Y, right? So let's say the sentiment model, the AI is a sentiment model, predicts negative sentiment when there is alcohol that's mentioned in the review, right? So that's immediately the correlation or the causal relation that the customer basically spots. Alcohol is mentioned, so it's negative, even though the review is not necessarily negative. And then the engineer comes, I'm sorry, but this is not how it works. Of course, a sentiment model normally doesn't depend on just one feature, right? There are many features which go into it, which interact with each other. So we have a classifier, it's trained using recurrent neural networks on a specific type of data, and so on. So it gives this very full, detailed, and truthful explanation of the system, which is not helpful, right? Because first thing is that the customer, in most cases, is not able to understand it. And even technical people are not necessarily able to understand it. And then additionally, of course, when you hear something you don't understand, then the customer is also kind of tense to think, okay, either I'm stupid or they're trying to cheat me or whatever, right? So basically no positive emotional effect and also no insight for the customer here. Second one, also a popular one among the customers and a very unpopular one for the engineers. So basically equaling AI errors to bugs, right? So again, we are in sentiment. So the sentiment on this customer review is wrong. Maybe they want to put it on a presentation for the management and so on. So how can we fix this, right? And then the engineer comes, okay, that's normal, of course, no AI model, which is where's the name, right? Except if it's a very simple and not so useful AI model, has 100% accuracy, right? So our sentiment model, let's say, is 90% accuracy, which is very high, but it logically means that 10% of the predictions are off, right? So then the choice for the engineer is either to go and implement some kind of one-time hack for this specific review, right? Or to work really fundamentally on improving the model, right? And that's something that's that then also needs to be explained to the customer. Third example, yeah, wrong expectations about the interactions of the user, right? So for example, that's something that's a real conversation that we had about search recently. So at the moment, we need to provide really specific prompts to make the search work. How can we improve this? And then the engineer, of course, yes, the more specific your prompts, the better for the AI. We all know this, right? It stands and it's written in every like basic prompting article, guide, and so on. So try to make your prompts even more specific. Again, it's true, but it's not what the customer wants to hear, right? They want to save time, they want to make their job easier, they don't want to spend as many brain calories and so on, right? So they really want actually to stick to making simple prompts. So these are just a couple of examples about these wrong mental models, right? So just to come back to our project, what we learned is that since we use a lot of data visualization, we saw that it really makes sense to oversimplify at the beginning, right? So we use this, we do this kind of complex trend analytics. So at the beginning, we thought, okay, we can use all kinds of these fancy data visualizations. We came up with a chart that was 3D. it was animated, right? So you have this trend space, and all the trends are interacting with each other. Technologies are interacting with products. Then you have the regulators coming in, somehow regulating, restricting everyone, and so on. All of that was visualized in a very, let's say, fancy way, right? Of course, feedback was super great design, but we cannot really use that. And especially we cannot show that to management. That's always, the killer argument is if they cannot show it to the management. Um, so feedback taken, we go back, and then we basically simplify the visualization. The next meeting, it was bar charts. I think bar charts are probably the most concise and in some way also elegant visualization of data. But then the feedback here was that, yes, it looks nice and so on, but we need to understand what do your scores mean and so on. Can't you just give us a list of the trends? So at the end, we finished up with, giving them the selection between bar chart for the more visual people, and then just a list with some additional, so a table, basically. Yeah, let's call it a table for those people who were more like mathematically and not so visually minded, right? So that was basically the learning that, okay, when it comes to data visualization, we really need to start simple. But then the second one was because, oh, now it happened. The second learning was that we started simple, but then at some point they learn these basic visualizations and they want more, right? So again, basically a natural path. So what we did here is that we build multiple levels behind the visualizations where they can basically drill down on any of the data points, then see the data behind it, see the complexity behind it, and so on. Also addressing different user personas, because when it's management, the bar chart is sufficient, right? And also for many knowledge workers, of course, the bar chart, the simple visualization is sufficient. They're just looking for a specific insight. But when you have data analysts whose task it actually is to somehow mix the data to find some more unique insights and so on, then they need additional flexibility. They need additional detail, even if it comes at the cost of more complexity in the user interface. So that was for mental models. Now, the second part, so how do we actually build the mental models? Of course, it is by explaining the AI and then also educating the users about AI in general. We cannot expect them to do that themselves. So that's why when we build AI products, we are on a mission to shape the mental models of our users, right? By explaining the specific system and on the side also by educating them about AI in general. Now, of course, it's difficult to explain AI, right? So all these models, they have millions of parameters, billions of parameters, many, many parameters, right? Even if it's just thousands, yeah? Like you might have a logistic regression model that just has hundreds or thousands of parameters, but it's still a lot of data and a lot basically of volume that they need to comprehend. So that's why in most cases, the full explanation of the model is not only impossible, but it's also not really desired, right? Because customers want something that they can understand. So we should aim for a partial explanation. How can that explanation look? Imagine that you have this big black box, which is your AI system, and then you can basically uncover some of the points in it. So the first one, which is probably one of the most relevant, is of course the capabilities and the limitations of the system. I would put an emphasis here on the limitations, right? Because I think that we are all used to a lot of marketing, a lot of some overselling, right? So normally we don't have an issue with stating the capabilities of what we're building, but we rather have issues with stating the limitations of what it cannot do, what users should not buy it for, and so on. So here maybe this fun meme or a story, right? Maybe some of you remember Clippy. It was one of Microsoft's very early AI assistants, which was also eventually discontinued. And the point is that basically you would be working in your Microsoft Windows, in your Office applications, writing documents, maybe building a financial plan and so on. And then at some point, Clippy would come out and offer help, right? Help which was not always in the domain of its competence. So here you have this very extreme example, right? On the one hand, you have this villain who is trying to take control of a strategic satellite or whatever. And then you have Clippy who comes out and asks, okay, hey there, it looks like you're trying to take over the world. How can I help? Right? So it's funny, it's cute, but it's just, you know, in a real context of production use, it can be misleading. And at some point, it can also be annoying if it repeats over a time, right? So that's why it's really important to state the limitations of the system. Then the second point that's a bit related to the limitations is the quality and the accuracy of the system, right? So if you have a sentiment model, okay, it gets the prediction right with a 90% or a 0.9 probability, right? That gives the user an indication of when they might need to go back to the original data point, to check the data and so on. Third point, the data sources. So what is the data that went into a specific prediction, that went into a specific model, and so on? That's an easy one, right? Except if you're OpenAI and so on. Normally, it's you can describe the data that you use for your models, right? Otherwise, it's a bit questionable. But what we found is that for customers, it really provides them this kind of, you know, kind of grounding and something very tangible in the real world, right? Just like when you go to a restaurant, many people prefer to know what went specifically into the dish, right? Rather than just eating it, right? So it's the same thing here. Basically, it provides this this grounding in the real world. And then, of course, additionally, it also gives them the possibility to go back and to check the data themselves. So just an example from our product, right? We have the famous bar chart on the left and also other charts. And basically what we do is that for each of the data points that we show, we also give them the possibility to click on it. And then they will see a sample of the most relevant data points behind it. Okay, then the first one, how the model or the models in the system work. So this is a tricky one. As said, it's very difficult to explain in words how an AI model works, right? So here it's always good to use some kind of metaphors, analogies, examples can also be very useful, right? So really here you should try to formulate it in a quite intuitive and non-mathematical language. So again, in our products, normally, you know, behind the core predictions, we will have tooltips or other explanation items that will basically explain how the result came about. And finally, how to act on the output. So that's especially relevant for the descriptive and analytical AI applications, right? So for example, if you have a sentiment output or an aggregated sentiment, what can you do based on it? It doesn't really explain the AI system in itself, right? But somehow what we found is that that's a super important part of the explanation that can really also increase the user satisfaction significantly, right? Probably because for them, you know, it's actually much more relevant than knowing how the models work, for instance, or what exactly the data is, right? For them, it's really important to understand how can I act on it, because that's ultimately the value of the whole system. And that's it. So this part, it remains black. Yeah, you have there all the stuff, you know, the data sources that you forgot to mention, all the mathematical details about the models and so on. So a part of the system will always remain black, right? But what we have found is that when you do a good job here, then the customers can start using the model. And importantly, as they use the model, they can start building trust into the model. Third component, why is trust important? That's a quote from a book that's nowhere related to AI. So basically, The Speed of Trust by Stephen R. Covey. Nothing is as fast as the speed of trust, right? So he discusses it in the scope or in the context of business relationships, right? So business, the old school way, basically everything is based on relationships, you have the gentleman handshake and so on. So basically, when people know each other, then the transactions are also much faster. Business the new way, now everything is digitalized. There is a lot of anonymous transactions that are going on and so on. So that's why we have a lot of this compliance overhead, a lot of bureaucracy, and that's why transactions can also take a much longer time. That's the human analogy. In AI, it's very similar, right? So if your users trust your product, they will buy it, they will use it, and they will also promote it among their peers, right? Just as we have it in business relationships. What are some, oh, yeah, okay. So basically when you build trust, you work between two extremes. So on the one hand, you have no trust, right? Which basically means that, okay, the users will just not adopt your product and they will not get the value out of your product. And then on the other hand, you have over trust. So that means that when the user switches on the AI, they switch off their head, they switch off their brain, right? And whatever comes out from the AI, they will just try it, they will just trust it, and they will basically accept it. That means that, of course, you can also have significant negative consequences because you can just use the wrong outputs for decision making, right? Depends a bit on the situation in which you're in, but if we talk about situations where like safety is involved, livelihoods, finance, health is involved, then of course overall trust can have very bad and very serious consequences. So as a product builder, you should try to find the sweet spot in between the two extremes, which is basically called calibrated trust, where your users use the AI outputs in a responsible way, right? So ideally, when there is a high confidence about an AI output, they will accept it, right? So that way they also have this efficiency gain, the speed gain from the AI. On the other hand, if an output is more questionable, the confidence is low, then they will go back, they will trace it back to the original data, they will verify it, and at some point they might also just reject it. So what are some of the core components of trust? Basically, on the one hand, we have understanding, so explainability and the transparency of the system. This is what we covered in the first two parts of the talk, right? So uncovering this AI black box. Then second is the utility. So when you understand the system, but the system fails to deliver on what it promises, of course, you cannot build trust, right? So that's why really we see it as you give this understanding first, right? So you give the transparency first, but then users need to start using the system. They need to complete their mental model, and they also just need to see that it works in terms of functionality, in terms of accuracy, reliability over time, and only then they can really build the trust. And then finally, also the stakes and the impact of the decision or the situation, right? So if we talk, as said, about health or finance or safety, autonomous driving, and so on, then you need to work harder to build trust than if you talk about recommendations on Netflix or on YouTube, right? There it's okay, you trust, maybe you lose some time watching something that you don't like, right? But the stakes are not so high. Okay, so our learnings here on trust calibration, well, first of all, it's really something that we also calibrate over time on our side. So it's really something that is more an art than a technique. And what we also found that it depends on many external factors, right? So on the one hand, we have the user persona. So I talked before about the data analysts, then the knowledge workers, and the managers, right? These are kind of the three core user personas that we generally distinguished in this project. And it really makes a huge difference for the trust calibration, right? So for example, data analysts, they have a good understanding of the data. They know what goes into it. So they're really better able to calibrate their trust. Managers are normally not so much able to calibrate trust, right? Because they just believe what they see. They believe, let's not say they believe what they see. They believe what they're shown, right? Because in our case, managers didn't use the final product. Instead, they get ready-made presentations by the employees. So there is already a very strong human filter that got into the outputs that they see. There is timing, right? So trust can also develop over a time. At the beginning, of course, you have less trust. Then over a time, the trust can build. So that's on the side of the user, but it's also a bit on the side of the AI, because if you have a system that continuously optimizes itself, then the utility of the system also grows over a time, right? So you have this kind of double effect there. And also there is the stakes of the situation as described before, right? So for example, in our product, the recommendations, they recommend specific projects and initiatives to the company. And of course, if you have a project that's, let's say, about a marketing hack, right, versus you have a project which is about developing a new strategic product or a technology in the company, then the stakes and the investment needed on the side of the company is different, right? So it's easier to trust the marketing hack and to say, okay, it was a fail, so we continue with the next one, than it would be with investing into a new deep technology. That was the first learning, right? So just that it's really a very fine-grained and very nuanced enterprise to calibrate trust. And the second one, I think it's also quite, very interesting learning, because what we normally think about, and I think as product people in general, right, we're always very much focused on the user, on somehow pleasing the user. If the user doesn't get it, then the design is bad, and so on, right? So that's the I would say the major school we have at the moment. What we saw with trust is that trust is really a two-way street, right? So of course, in the first place, we need to make the users trust us. Otherwise, they will not use the product, they will not buy it, and so on. But then on the other hand, we also need to see how much can we actually trust the users, right? So how much can we trust that they will use the product in correct ways? And if they're not able to use it in the specific way we want them to use it, then we need to simplify the AI functionality. We need to only provide the high confidence outputs, and so on, right? So it kind of limits the whole capability of the system. But that goes back, of course, to the education. So it's not just the user's responsibility. To a large degree, it's also our responsibility again. Okay, and then comes the final component. So basically co-creation. There are many aspects of it, right? So there is this aspect that, okay, we can collect data from the users to improve the system. We can collect their feedback as we do in normal product management, right? To implement new capabilities, new features, to address new needs. One aspect that I would like to focus on today in this whole field is basically how we can balance control and automation in AI products. So we have here again a continuum. You see I like continuums from no automation at all, right, to a product that is fully automated. So the user has a big red button that they can just press, and then the product goes off and comes back with a result, and they don't know what it did in the meantime. And in between, we have these two items. So basically, we have assisted AI. I would say it's a product like Grammarly, right? So you as the user, you're still writing the text, and then Grammarly will come and make some suggestions here and there, right? But you as the user, you're still in full control of the process. And then we also have augmented AI, where the AI basically already acts as a partner to the human user, right? So really augmenting them in their capabilities. Now, of course, to many of us, it might seem that full automation is the great ideal that we should be striving for, right? Because it really saves us time. We can go off, we can go to the beach, we can maybe do another job, earn more money, and so on. But in reality, full automation is often not possible, at least with the current state of the technology. So that's just a fact that we should accept. And then on the other hand, it's also not always desirable, right? Because on the one hand, you have humans that have their own strengths, and then you have the AI that also has its own strengths and weaknesses, right? So for humans, they're good at, something that AI probably will not be able to do is all this field of the emotional and social skills that we as humans excel in, right? So basically empathy, socializing, building relationships, and so on. Then also putting things into very complex context, right? So if you're leading a company, you're building the strategy for your company, then you need to consider a lot of different factors in your environment, in your company. You need to put them all together, add your expertise from the past, right? So it's really a very complex context that you're building. On the other hand, AI, of course, is great if you have big data quantities. You can just run them through the machine. You can get some insights out of it. You can also use it if you want to automate some of these large scale tasks, right? So like customer service, the basic requests of customer service, fraud detection, and so on, right? So really these more routine and very well delimited tasks. That's about the skill distribution. And then also, I think that humans, and that's also what we see with customers, they also, for some jobs, they don't want full automation, right? Because some of the jobs, they really get some additional value of just doing the job manually, right? So let's say you're writing a book, yeah, then you probably don't want just to push that big red button and get the book out at the end, except if you're doing it for a pure marketing purposes, right? That's a different case, right? Or again, writing a company strategy, right? You have such a sense of responsibility and of accountability for it if you're, let's say, a goodwill manager, that you will normally not want to delegate such a task to the AI. So for us, most of our work is in the field of augmented AI, and I think that that's also what most companies that try to automate or support more or less complex workflows are also working in at the moment. So how do we do that? Just to give you a quick example, right? So normally we will build the user journey of the process that we're modeling, right? So here you have a very simple, just for graphical purposes. So if, the task is basically to support the users when they ideate and select new projects, right? So they start with market analysis, competitor analysis, analysis of the customer needs, and so on. Then they go into idea generation, right? So you wrote an app, you collect a lot of new ideas, then you examine the ideas further and you kind of narrow down. I'm sure many of you know this double diamond model, right? So first you generate many new ideas, then you kind of limit them and filter them. At some point, you then take the decision and then you go into the execution. So then inside of this user journey, we basically analyze the automation potential of each step, right? You can see that it's not 100% in any of these stages, but we can automate a lot of the first stage by collecting a lot of data about the market and then also analyzing the data. The second component, so the recommender system, it supports the idea generation, right? So AI takes in all the market data, then it adds its own generative capabilities on top, and it can basically generate a lot of ideas. Then it already gets a bit more complicated, right? So the idea examination, basically let's say, filtering the ideas that's already a bit more company specific and a bit more conditioned by the individual users. The decision, we don't touch it, right? Because decisions obviously always have accountabilities, which at the moment, so for this system that we have been building, they just cannot be estimated, right? So it's just once we have historical data about the implementation of our recommendations that we can actually really provide the decisions. And then finally, the execution, which we support by providing well, not real time, but dynamic data about the specific initiative over a time, right? So for example, we monitor what do the competitors do on similar initiatives, right? If the initiatives or the project is about implementing a new technology, then we will go and monitor, okay, how does this technology develop? Are there any new publications, patents, and so on coming out about it? That was the last component, right? So just to recap some points. So just quick summary. So at the start, when you start building AI, try to be conservative, try to be defensive, and assume that your users have an incorrect mental model. Then AI models and AI systems are black boxes. So as you build them, you also need to kind of crack them open and explain their content to the users so you can start building trust. And then trust is built, so on the one hand, by educating the users, and on the other hand, also delivering on the promises that you're making to them. So then once you're able to build this trust, you can also really go into this co-creation relationship and really building a human-centric AI experience. And I would like to emphasize this point of responsibility. I don't know, one of you mentioned it, right? So I think that really AI is new to all those user crowds that have been using digital products for decades now, right? So I think that really when you're a product manager, a product builder, you have a startup that's building using AI, then you really need to take on this responsibility also in inducing this shift in the mindset of the users, right? So we cannot leave this task to the users alone. I think that will kind of fail in the collective enterprise of AI. That's it. Thanks a lot. I think it was a long talk, right? So